First Samuel 18 is where we are. First Samuel, the 18th chapter. It's not a lot here. It's a narrative, as we've been talking about. We have pulled some lessons out of some of the chapters, but as I got to studying this, I thought, well, there's not just a whole lot to pull out per se, but it is good to be reminded of the history of Israel, to see the hand of God, to see how God preserved his people, if you will, and how God took care of them. And ultimately then we can extrapolate that, I think, correctly so, in the fact that God takes care of us. But God had a plan. And through Israel, of course, God was going to lead all of us, if you will, to the promised land. And so I think it's good to at least be reminded of this history. It's interesting as we get into the 18th and the 19th chapters that we're winding up Saul, and yet he will still be here for the remainder of our study. And we're getting into David and his kingship. And David has been anointed already, according to what we've read. David has killed Goliath. David has come home. In the last really paragraph of the 16th chapter, and then I think also here in the beginning of the 18th chapter, there's some time that elapses. And so the author does not set about to really just say, here is the exact chronology of what happened. But it does give us some insight into some things. And so we will look at it from that standpoint, understanding that there's a period of time, especially in the first 4 verses of the 18th chapter. And for the life of me and for those that I've studied, they say the same thing. We don't know how long. Scriptures don't say. And so you could guess, but I don't think that's fair either. But it says that when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit together to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This bond is important. Jonathan and David's bond. We see it mentioned here. We will see it a little later in this book. But that bond, that friendship, that relationship is important. And it's interesting that as we get into it, how that relationship seems to be deeper than the father-son relationship that Jonathan should have had. But nevertheless, David and Jonathan are knit together, tight friends. Saul took him that day and would not let him go to his father's house anymore. So David was taken in. Remember one of the things we said about Saul. Saul had begun to almost draft people. Anybody he could find for a soldier that was willing and able and more able than willing, he took. And he's taken David. David has killed Goliath, and so now he has taken David in. And you might say, well, wait a minute. What about that Spirit of the Lord that caused that angst within Saul that we talked about last week and couldn't figure out really what it is? Well, it's going to come up a couple more times here in this chapter. It seemed to come and go. Some would say, well, maybe the jealousy hasn't kicked in, because I think we see this more beginning in the 7th verse of this chapter. That could be it. Maybe it was part of a plan. Take him in, and as we take him in, he'll think that we love him and that we're all right and we're buddies, and we're really not. It doesn't say, and we don't know. But nevertheless, he's taken in. He's not allowed to go home. Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him, gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. Everything he had. Some have speculated the reason that he gave his robe to David was because he was abdicating. He already saw within David a leadership role. And so he was abdicating his being the next king to David. Maybe, maybe not. After all, if you really stop and think about it, being a king in Israel was new. This is something that they hadn't probably established all the pomp and circumstance and rules of who's next, the traditions. Thank you. That's a good word, and that we're looking for. But he gives. Notice what he gives him. He gives him his robe. He also gives him his armor, even his sword. Maybe you could say, Jonathan, quit fighting. Maybe. I don't know that that's the reason. But then he gave him his bow, of course, but his belt. Now, belt we figure is part of a sash or a belt that may have carried his sword. And so he gave him basically his whole armor. And so David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. This is a more important verse than you might realize. This is one of those when you read it, you think, well, okay, it adds to the story. This adds to the story later on. When it gets down to it, especially, there's a difference with regards to Saul and what are we going to do with David, and Saul will turn on David. And yet we have to understand that David was accepted with people. And David was even accepted by some of Saul's servants. Now it happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine that the women had come out of the cities, out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now, it seems as if we have to go back in time a little bit. Verse 6, think about it. This is as they're coming home, but the first 5 verses of this chapter, almost as if there had been some time elapsed. And so, like I say, it's hard to follow the chronology of it, not the story, but the chronology of the story. David, though, is coming back. He's the victor. He has killed Goliath. He's killed the giant. And it was customary for the women to come home with the men, so to speak, meet them out a certain way, especially when they'd heard of a victory, and to come and to have sort of a party coming into town. And so this was not unusual. There's a lot of singing and dancing, victory dancing, if you will, tambourines, a lot of musical instruments. It's a victory party, if you will. But notice what the women did. They sang this antiphonal song, which simply means that you have one number and then the next number builds higher. So you're increasing. And so they say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Willis makes the point, it's kind of a good point, I think. We don't know if the people were upset at Saul enough that they really wanted to embarrass or hurt Saul, make him angry. It does. Matter of fact, that's the very next statement. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. Or whether it was just the fact that this was a style of song that was sung in that day and age, and they were just singing it because David, after all, had killed the giant Goliath, that for 40 days they had basically stood afar and said, no, we don't want to fight him. Whatever the case may be, the reaction, whether it was what they wanted or not, was what they got. He was very angry. And he said, they've ascribed to David thousands, and to me they've ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have been, now what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul's jealousy begins, if it hasn't already. I think it already has. I think we saw it earlier on, but it begins. He had grown in popularity. He had grown in power. This is talking about Saul. And consequently, those two sometimes feed an ego of a man. And so now he seems to become very jealous. Okay, he's going to take over the kingdom. So Saul eyed David from that day forward. He had great suspicion about David. What's he doing? What's he up to? It seems as if maybe he was looking for something in order that he might kill David. Notice it says he eyed David. He was watching him, watching to see what he was doing, watching to see where he was going, watching to see what his motives were, watching to see how he was doing with other people. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit, now we've already seen that in the 16th chapter, and we concluded we don't know. We don't know what it was. Was it a spirit, if you will, that came upon him, maybe a temperament, maybe a temper that came upon him? Could be. Was it a mental illness? Some have said. Some have said that, theologians get to speculating because they can't find enough to do in the text, so they begin to speculate. Some have speculated there's a brain tumor. Whatever it was something that seemingly it came and it went, but what it had was great jealousy. And so this spirit, if you will, this distressing spirit, notice that it says that it came from God, came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. The word prophesied is interesting. The Hebrew word is the idea of he threw a fit. That you look at that and we say, well, prophesied, that just simply means that he preached, that he spoke. But the Hebrew word that is translated prophesied here means that he threw a fit. He was angry enough that he threw a fit. So David played music, and that was part of the allure and charm of having David around. We saw that earlier on, is that David could play his harp and David could soothe Saul when he got into this temperament. David played his music with his hand, as at other times. But this time, there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now, how did he do that? Doesn't say. Did Saul throw it but not hit him? That would seem to be the probability of the story. So Saul, let's go on. Now, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. His fear grew. I find this verse interesting. And why I find it interesting is because he's afraid of David, but notice that he thoroughly believes, and rightfully so, the Lord's with David. Now, exactly how he came to that conclusion to this point, we don't know. But he says, Lord's with him, and the text says, and Saul also realizes the Lord has departed from him. So his fear grows. So with his jealousy, there's a fear. You can see a man that is going to have a lot of problems, going to have a lot of ego issues, a lot of mental anguish, because he sees all this. Therefore, Saul removed him, David, from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. Now, that's interesting. Why in the world, if he was after him and didn't like him, why wouldn't he just banish him? Well, sometimes you keep your enemies close to you. But he made him captain over 1,000. And he went out and he came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all of his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Now remember, this, when it talks about Israel and Judah, Israel, as we know it, is still a united kingdom. It divides later on. Divides really with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And of course, that's Solomon's kids, if you will. But yet, if you go back and you look and you try to figure out, if you got some maps, some Bible maps, You know that just as it divided Israel to the north and Judah to the south, you had Israel and Judah. Israel was, really, to be honest, it's where modern day Israel is today. It's the Dead Sea, and just a little bit, the boundary lines were just a little bit north of the Dead Sea. Judah is more of as we think of it, or excuse me, that was Israel was to the north, Judah was to the south. Israel would then pick up that line and carried it north and somewhat north of the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't a divided kingdom. Matter of fact, if you want to know even further where Gaza is today, that was Philistia. That was where the Philistines were. So that gives you just a geographical sense. But Israel and Judah loved David. Now that's important because there's not going to be a popularity problem, but if there had been, it seems as if David was winning people over. So he had a winning spirit about him. He had a good spirit about him. And evidently he behaved himself very well and people liked him. Now, anything anybody like to say or ask? Abner. Abner was head of the soldiers. Some say you go back down here to verse 13 where it talks about captain over 1,000, that he was just head over a group, and that, you know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, he would have had his own guard, yes. Yeah. But see, at least to me, he sent David out. So it was not uncommon to send a small army out and take care of whatever you needed in the kingdom and out of the kingdom. And so, yeah, Abner was I guess captain, for lack of a better term. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
We see the same thing today. If you have somebody in your organization that you want to get rid of, best thing to do is promote them.
Yeah. Very true. Very true. Very true.
You're right.
Well, he's right. Yeah.
He's always the reason he knows it.
That's so true. Yeah. Works like that everywhere, yeah. Anything else? It's so true. Well, David is going to pick up a wife. Different pronunciations of this. We'll just pronounce it Michael. And I know that sounds like a guy's name, but it's a girl. And think about this. This is interesting because, once again, you get a sense of the author is not trying to convey chronology. He's trying to convey the story. Because, remember, part of the prize, if you will, for killing Goliath was the king's daughter in marriage. Saul says to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." And so he's going to send David out. His hope is, seemingly, at least as Samuel wrote this book by inspiration, they'll kill him. And the blood of David then won't be on my hands. It'll be on their hands. And so, what does he do? He says, David said to Saul, "Who am I? And what is my life? Or my father's family in Israel that I should be the son-in-law to the king. But it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholothite, as a wife. Now, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. So it's not a loveless marriage, arranged, seemingly, yes, but not loveless. She loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, I'll give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. She may have not been a present that was worthy of want. But nevertheless, hey, yeah, she'll cause you a lot of headaches, Bubba. You can have her. And so he gives, I think it's funny. There's a lot I could say, but I would be so much in trouble. So I'll just not say it. Therefore, Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, communicate with David secretly and say, look, the king has delight in you, and all of his servants love you. Now, therefore, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David, and David said, does it seem to you a light thing to be king's son-in-law, seeing I am poor and lightly esteemed man? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, in this manner David spoke. So David just simply, he says it kind of out straight, Does it seem sort of strange to you that I'm just a poor old boy and just, if you really got down to it, old shepherd boy, I don't have anything. And yet, seemingly, I am a poor but yet lightly esteemed man, but I'm the king's son-in-law. That's a great question. In many ways, maybe I'm wrong, but it shows David's humility. Shows that okay, he wasn't a guy that just thought so highly of himself to say, hey, look where I am and look who I am. But he was a man that was humble and humble of heart and humble of thought. But then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire my dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. This is part of Saul's plan. Send David to the Philistines. Tell him that he's got to kill 100 soldiers. Now, I'm not so sure that I would want to bring back 100 foreskins, but he does that. Let's read the story. Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. See, I'm innocent of this. The Philistines killed him. That was his plan. That was his hope. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David arose, went he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. That was his present to the king. And remember, you had to give, dowries. You had to give something to your father-in-law. And I told my father-in-law I'd take Suzanne off his hands, and that's a whole different issue. No, I didn't either. I actually didn't speak to my father-in-law. I didn't talk much to him because, as Suzanne said, he didn't talk much. He didn't. And so I asked Suzanne without even asking her grandparents. I asked Suzanne to marry me, and she said yes, thankfully. And it's worked for 40 years. I shared with them in the membership committee meeting. Suzanne and I went to Hattie B's Friday night to eat, and we walked up and we placed our order, or started to place our order. And the guy, he was probably in his late 30s, early 40s, just very wonderful personality. And he said it would be about a 20-minute wait on food. And I just looked at him and I said, does that mean I have to talk to her for 20 minutes? And Suzanne said, well, yes. And I looked at him and I said, you've ruined a good 40-year marriage. And he kidded then. He went off with that. But David says, okay, I'm going to have to pay the dowry. I'll bring back not the 100 that you've asked, but 200. Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy. Now, notice this next word. It's very important. Your version may have like the rest of his days, the remainder of his days. The New King James Version says just continually. He went from maybe, well, he might be my enemy to now he is, and I don't like him. There's nothing about him I like. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war. And so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. So David went out, and David behaved, and the people liked him, and the people enjoyed him. Anything else? Yes. 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 Yeah, it's interesting how stories repeat themselves. Yes, and that's one of them. Very true. Anything else? Well, we've got a few minutes. Let's go on into the 19th chapter. Saul persecutes David. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son, to all of his servants, that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. Remember, there was that bond. Not that you all didn't know that. I mean, y'all studied this book many times before, but just remember that. Jonathan loved David, and this was a bond that was just, it was tight. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father Saul seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. And I'll go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe, I will tell you. That took a lot of gumption, didn't it? I mean, even though he loved David, he's still going against his father, and his father has shown himself already. I mean, he threw a spear. Evidently, he didn't hit David, but he threw a spear at David. And not only that, but I'm sure it became quite evident to Jonathan that Dad's out to kill David. Now, I'm going to talk to him. We're going to talk, and I'm going to tell David what's going on. But look what he says. He says, look at the very first verse. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all of his servants that they should kill David. So Jonathan knew what was about to happen, but he wanted to speak to his father, and so he intercedes. Now, beginning in verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David. Notice the four arguments, if you will, in quick succession of one another. But he says, because he's not sinned against you. In other words, why are you doing anything against him? He hasn't sinned against you, number one. And number two, because his works have been very good towards you. He's been kind towards you. Even when you asked for the dowry, he brought back twice as much as what you had asked for. And he has not talked about you. He's not gone behind your back. He's treated you well. He has returned, if you stop and think about the difference between Saul and David, Saul is returning evil for good, and David is returning good for the evil that Saul was perpetrating upon him. David was acting the way he should. Saul was not. But Jonathan says, the works that he's done towards you are good. 3, verse 5, for he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. He says, as a result of what he did by taking his life in his own hands, he delivered Israel. And number 4, you saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without cause? You might even add a 5th one. He's innocent. He's innocent. And so his argument stands. So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, He shall not be killed. It's a promise. But here's the caveat as you keep reading. I'm not so sure it was an honest promise. Or if it was an honest promise at that time, Saul did not keep it very long. So whichever way I think you want to look at it, there's not a problem there because text really doesn't say, but it does say that he made this promise, and it's not long before he's after David. Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. So Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. There was war again. David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now the distressing spirit, we've talked about that, this is the third time, from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing music with his hand. Then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with a spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and this, of course, will be the second time, and he drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, Saul's daughter, of course, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. This then becomes, if you will, a not a murder for hire necessarily, but really a killing of David, a murder of David, but everyone seems to know about it. Everyone seems to know about the impending danger that David is facing. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image, laid it in the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with clothes. So when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Then Saul sent the messenger back to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. When the messengers had come in, there was the image in the bed, with a cover of goat's hair for his head. Then Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this, and sent my enemy away, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? If you look at this story, you come up with a moral dilemma, don't you? What's the moral dilemma? Yeah. She's lying. One of the things you have to look at, though, and you have to answer, or I think you answer it this way, is she is not commended for her lying. She lies, but it's really not what God wanted us to do, her to do, but she did nevertheless. And so there's your moral dilemma. And there would be, if you will, if you're going to make a movie about this, there's what you could center on for your moral dilemma and your plot. So David, verse 18, fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. He and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth, is how it's pronounced, Naioth, Naioth. Now it was told Saul, saying, take note, David, that in Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, and when they saw the group of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as a leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. Now this is a little different word, and so this is not the idea of throwing a fit. This is more the idea of they're speaking. And when Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. Then Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they prophesied also. Then he also went to Ramah and came to the great well that is at Seku. So he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, indeed, they are in Naioth and Ramah. So he went there to Naioth and Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also, and he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. And he also stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore, they say, is Saul also among the prophets? This is what's caused caused some to speculate exactly maybe Saul had a mental issue going on. To lie down naked all day and all night, different. But it's kind of at least foretelling in many ways that Saul sees the end. He's trying to get rid of David. His best efforts seemingly have failed, and he seems to be getting worse. He seems to be progressing. I have often thought, and this is one of those things that is simply just Paul Daugherty thought, and so for you it may not be worth anything, and that's fine. But as I have studied these verses, I have thought that Saul had some sort of mental issue. Now what, I can't tell you, but it seems as if Saul has just simply gone off the deep end. Did he have a nervous breakdown? Or is it just the fact that he was a man with a disposition of anger and meanness about him, and he saw that all of his power and his prestige and the people liking him and God being with him, it was just something that was falling apart. And his house of cards, if you will, was being destroyed. That's a possibility. And I don't know that, we really have to make a decision on that. What is the right answer? I think we just have to see the story as really sad, the way Saul's life and the way, his reign kind of went downhill and his life ended as it did. Anything else? Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 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 The Lord, he was, and he realized that, and he realized the Lord was with David, and so I think it is. But yeah, to get a definitive answer, I can't. But I think that's right. Anything else? Well, like I say, just not just a whole lot there to make application, other than don't lie. But it doesn't say that there, but she did, and I do think it's important that we do think of the fact that we do need God with us, as George said, and that we need to make sure that God is with us by walking with Him. And as we walk with Him, of course, as we talked about Sunday in the sermon, He walks with us. And by walking with Him and Him walking with us, then we understand that we are His in more ways than just being a Christian. We're His children. And He watches over us, helps us, and protects us. And Saul didn't have that. And also, one of the things that probably doesn't affect most of us, and that is the idea of power. We're not high-ranking officials here. And so, but yet at the same time, too, we can have too much pride, and that pride can go to seed and create difficulties. And so we need to be careful of that. There are 6 things the Lord hates. Yea, 7 are abomination unto Him. Number 1, what is it? Proud look. Proud look. Anything else? Well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, thankful for many blessings, thankful for loving us and watching over us, thankful for taking care of us, thankful for everything you have done for us. And we ask that you be with us, that we will constantly lean upon you and that we will constantly hold to you, realizing that you are our stay, but realizing that you are our rock that will get us through life and all of its tragedies, but all of its good times as well. We ask that you be with those that were mentioned earlier in the announcements, those that are going through tests and illness, and those that will soon have procedures. We ask that you bless them and keep them. Be with each one of us. Watch over us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. We'll see you Sunday.